Harold Thompson took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air as he stepped out of his cabin. The golden hues of the morning sun filtered through the towering pine trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. At 68, his body was slower, but his instincts remained razor-sharp, a relic of his years as a Marine. His daily walk through the woods had become more than a routine. It was his way of staying connected to something larger than himself. Today, however, something felt different. The silence was unnatural. Harold paused on the porch, his boot crunching against the frost-kissed planks. Normally, the forest was alive with sound, birds calling to one another, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. But now, there was nothing. No crows cawing, no squirrels darting between the trees. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. His heartbeat slowed, years of training settling into his bones. Silence in the wild was never a good sign. He reached inside his cabin door and retrieved his rifle. A habit from days long past, but one he never abandoned. The weight of the weapon felt familiar in his hands, a reminder of who he once was and who he still could be. If necessary, he stepped onto the narrow trail leading away from his cabin, his boots making almost no sound against the damp earth. The forest stretched before him, an ancient, living thing that he had come to know intimately. Every tree, every rock, every bend in the path was familiar. And yet, today, it all felt foreign. Harold moved cautiously, scanning the undergrowth for any signs of disturbance. He crouched near a cluster of ferns, running his fingers over the soil. It was disturbed, recently. A set of prints, deep and deliberate, pressed into the ground. They weren't from a deer or any other animal he expected to see. No, these were boots. Human. His jaw tightened. It wasn't just that someone had walked through his woods. It was the way they had moved, calculated, methodical. Whoever they weren't hiking. They were tracking. And Harold had a feeling he was the prey. Harold Thompson stopped in his tracks as he approached the small creek that wound its way through the forest. The clear, cold water reflected the amber glow of the autumn sun. But it wasn't the scenery that held his attention. Standing in the middle of the narrow path were two bear cubs. He had seen bears many times before, solitary ones. Mothers with their young, old males moving through the territory. But these cubs weren't acting like any he had ever encountered. They didn't run. They didn't cower. Instead, they stood there, staring at him with something that felt eerily close to hope. One of them let out a strange sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a growl. It was an attempt at something more. Communication. Harold tightened his grip on his rifle. His instincts screamed at him to back away. A mother bear could be nearby. And if she was, he had seconds, maybe less, before she came barreling out of the trees. But no attack came, no warning roars, no crashing through the underbrush. Just the quiet of the forest and these two small creatures looking at him like they expected something. Then, the larger of the two cubs did something even stranger. It rose up on its hind legs, lifting its front paws and waving them in a slow, deliberate motion, not in panic, not in aggression, but in something that almost resembled a signal. Harold felt a shiver crawl up his spine. This wasn't normal. He had spent years in the wilderness, long enough to know the patterns of the wild. Animals were predictable, driven by instinct. They feared humans, or at the very least, avoided them. But these cubs weren't just standing their ground. They wanted him to follow. Every fiber of his military-trained mind told him to turn around. Following wild animals was a bad idea, especially when it came to bears. And yet, something deeper, something beyond logic, urged him forward. He exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle but keeping his hands ready. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "Show me what's so damn important." The cubs turned immediately, As if they understood, they scampered ahead, pausing every few feet to look back and make sure he was keeping up. Harold followed. The terrain grew rougher as he moved deeper into the forest, the trees towering higher, their dense canopies casting long shadows. The air felt heavier here, charged with something he couldn't quite define. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The cubs led him up a narrow incline, their movements quick and urgent. His old marine instincts kept him alert, eyes scanning, ears tuned for the faintest sound. He wasn't alone out here. He could feel it. Then, he saw it, a clearing, and in the center, a large, unmoving shape. His breath hitched. It was their mother. The massive grizzly lay sprawled across the ground, her fur matted with blood. Deep gashes ran along her side, the wounds fresh but not made by claws. This wasn't a fight with another bear. This was something else. Harold took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding. The cubs whimpered beside him, nudging their mother's still body. She was breathing, barely, but unconscious. His mind raced. A wounded bear was dangerous. A desperate one, even more so. But this wasn't an attack waiting to happen. This was a plea for help. And then he saw it. The tracks. Boot prints. Human. Someone else had been here. Harold's jaw clenched as he crouched to examine the ground. The prints were deep, heavy, more than one person. And then, something else. A spent bullet casing. Half buried in the dirt. Not hunters. Poachers. His fingers curled into fists. He had no love for people who killed for sport, who took from nature without respect. He had lived long enough to know the difference between a man who hunted to survive and one who killed for the thrill of it. And whoever had done this was still out there. He looked at the cubs, their dark eyes filled with silent desperation. They had led him here for a reason, not just to witness their mother's suffering, but to do something about it. Harold rose to his feet, his old soldier's instincts taking over. He had spent years seeking solitude, avoiding the world beyond these trees. But today, the world had found him, and it was calling him to act. He checked his rifle, took one last look at the wounded mother bear, and turned toward the tracks leading deeper into the forest. Whoever had done this was still out there, and Harold Thompson was going to find them. Harold followed the bear cubs deeper into the forest, his breath steady, his grip firm on his rifle. The path grew steeper, the underbrush denser, branches clawing at his sleeves as if trying to warn him to turn back. But he pressed on. The cubs moved with urgency, scrambling over fallen logs, pushing through thick ferns, and occasionally looking back to make sure he was still following. He had never ventured this far before, though he had lived in these woods for years. This part of the forest was unfamiliar, uncharted territory even to him. Something about that unsettled him. After nearly an hour, they emerged into a clearing, and Harold's stomach turned. There, sprawled across the ground, was the mother bear, the massive grizzly he had seen earlier. But now he saw the full extent of her suffering. She wasn't just wounded, she was trapped. Steel jaws clamped around her limbs, cruel and unyielding, digging deep into her flesh. Blood seeped into the dirt, staining the ground beneath her. Around her lay a nightmarish scene, metal cages, coiled wires, and footprints pressed into the earth. A poacher's camp. Harold scanned the area, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. This wasn't some amateur setup. The traps were positioned with precision, hidden beneath layers of leaves and debris. The cages, large and rusted, were meant to transport animals, not kill them outright. Someone had planned this, someone had spent time here, and someone would be coming back. The bear cubs let out soft, pitiful cries as they nudged their mother's motionless form. She stirred slightly, but the pain was overwhelming. Her breathing was labored, her strength fading. Harold felt something tighten in his chest. The cubs hadn't led him here by chance. They had brought him here because they had no one else. He knelt beside the massive grizzly, careful not to startle her. Up close, the brutality of the trap was worse than he expected. The steel teeth bit deep, cutting through fur and muscle. If she stayed like this much longer, she wouldn't survive. Harold's jaw clenched. He had spent years distancing himself from the world, from people, from responsibility. But this he couldn't ignore. He set his rifle aside and pulled out the hunting knife strapped to his belt. The first trap was the worst, its springs rusted and stiff from years of neglect. He wedged the blade between the jaws, using his full weight to pry it open. The metal groaned in protest before finally giving way. The bear let out a low, painful growl, but she didn't lash out. Maybe she understood. Maybe she knew he was trying to help. One by one, he worked the traps loose, his hands growing slick with sweat and dirt. It took time, too much time. Every second felt like an eternity. Every snap lock like a battle won. Finally, the last trap fell away. The bear lay still, her breath shallow. The cubs clung to her, their small bodies pressed against her wounded form. Harold stood, rolling his stiff shoulders. The hard part was over. Now, he had a decision to make. He could leave. He could turn his back, walk away, and let nature take its course. He had done his part. The bear was free, but then his gaze drifted back to the cages. The footprints, the tools. The poachers weren't done here. They would come back, and they wouldn't stop at just one bear. Harold exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the grip of his rifle. He had spent decades avoiding conflict, choosing solitude over battle, but tonight, the war had found him. And Harold Thompson was a soldier once more. Harold Thompson had seen many things in his lifetime, battlefields littered with fallen men. The quiet grief in a soldier's eyes. The slow decay of trust in a world that never stopped taking. But this was something else. He gritted his teeth, his hands moving with practiced precision as he pulled his radio from his pack. National Park Service. This is Harold Thompson, former USMC. I've got a situation. Illegal poaching operation deep in the forest. Coordinates incoming. Wounded bear. Steel traps. Signs of an organized network. Suspects are likely armed. Over. Static crackled in response before a voice cut through. Copy that, Harold. Dispatching a ranger unit now. Stay put if possible. Do not engage. Repeat. Do not engage. But Harold already knew that wasn't an option. A low rumble rolled through the trees. He turned his head, eyes narrowing as a pair of headlights flickered through the dense foliage. The distant growl of engines grew louder, closer. They were coming back, and they weren't coming empty-handed. Harold quickly finished cutting the last of the wires holding the bear mother in place. She groaned, shifting slightly, but she was too weak to move. The cubs pressed against her, their tiny bodies trembling. No time. Harold grabbed his rifle and backed into the shadows, moving with the silent efficiency of a man who had spent years mastering the art of not being seen. He positioned himself behind a thick fallen log, his vantage point clear. Then they arrived. 3 vehicles, 2 old pickups, 1 covered cargo truck, all mud-streaked, their headlights slashing through the dark like searchlights. 5 men stepped out, their movements quick, efficient, not amateurs. They carried weapons, semi-automatics, knives strapped to their belts. Their clothes were rugged, suited for rough terrain, but what caught Harold's attention was the insignia on one man's sleeve. A red wolf's head, embroidered in a crude patch. A gang, not just random poachers, a full-scale operation. One of the men, stockier than the rest, spat onto the ground. Damn thing still here? He growled, his voice thick with an eastern accent Harold couldn't quite place. Another man, taller, meaner looking, kicked at one of the empty cages. Course she is. Where's she gonna go with half her leg torn up? A third, younger, checked his watch. Boss says we got a deadline. Buyer's expectin' her in 2 days. We gotta move fast. A buyer. Harold felt his blood run cold. This wasn't just about sport hunting. They were trafficking, moving live animals for profit. And it wasn't their first time. He scanned the area. They weren't being cautious. They weren't expecting trouble. That was their mistake. Harold shifted slightly, his fingers tightening around the rifle. He could take 1 or 2 out before they even knew what hit them. But 5, too risky. He needed to be smarter. The leader, stocky, motioned toward the bear. All right, let's get her loaded. Chain her up. Use the winch if you have to. Harold's muscles tensed as one of the men approached the mother bear. A tranquilizer gun in hand. Not happening. He inhaled, steadied his aim, and fired. The shot rang out like thunder in the silent forest. The man with the Tran-Q gun dropped instantly, his rifle spinning from his grasp. Chaos erupted. Shit, we got company. They scrambled, weapons raised, scanning the darkness. Harold ducked low, moving fast, changing position before they could pin him down. A barrage of bullets tore through the trees where he had been seconds before. They didn't know where he was. Good. Harold shifted again, lining up another shot. This time, he aimed for the truck tires. A single pull of the trigger, and the front left tire exploded, the vehicle sinking with a heavy lurch. Son of a... The gang fell back, shouting, searching. The leader cursed, gripping his pistol tight. Find him, whoever the hell he is. He ain't leaving here alive. Harold smirks grimly. That's what they thought. He reached for his radio again, whispering into the receiver. Shots fired, engaged with hostile targets. Move fast. A crackle, then, ETA 10 minutes. Hold your position. 10 minutes. A lifetime in a firefight. Harold moved again, keeping low. The poachers were spreading out now, creeping through the trees, trying to flush him out. The leader barked orders. He's alone. He's gotta be. Don't let him pick us off one by one. They were nervous. Good. Harold exhaled slowly, leveling his rifle at the nearest man. Another shot. Another body hitting the ground. Then, movement. Behind him. Too late. A figure lunged, tackling him hard. Harold hit the dirt, his rifle knocked from his grasp. His attacker was strong, desperate, fist swinging, but Harold wasn't some rookie. He twisted, using the man's momentum against him, flipping him over, a swift elbow to the throat, and the fight was over. But the commotion had given him away. More footsteps, more voices. Got him. Over here. Harold rolled, grabbing his knife just as another poacher charged. He barely dodged the swinging rifle butt, countering with a swift slash across the man's arm. A scream, a stumble, then another gunshot, but not his. A new voice rang out. Federal agents, drop your weapons. Spotlights cut through the trees. Flashing lights, the unmistakable sound of authority. The poachers panicked. Some ran, others fired wildly, but it was over. The Rangers swarmed in, their precision sharp, their presence overwhelming. One by one, the gang was subdued, their operation dismantled in minutes. Harold exhaled, wiping blood from his knuckles as the last of them were cuffed and hauled away. One of the Rangers, a woman with a sharp, assessing gaze, approached him. Harold Thompson? He nodded. She studied him for a long moment before offering a smirk. Hell of a way to make a report. Harold chuckled dryly. Figured you'd want it firsthand. She glanced at the bear and her cubs. We've got vets on the way. You saved her life. He looked at the mother bear, now breathing easier, her cubs still pressed close. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, finally, they saved mine first. And with that, Harold Thompson turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the forest that had always been his true home. The crackling of radios and the firm voices of federal agents filled the air as the poachers were forced to their knees. Their hands zip-tied behind their backs. The ambush had worked flawlessly. The poachers, caught off guard, had no time to fight back properly. Harold watched in silence as the officers moved through the camp, securing evidence, cages, illegal weapons, stacks of documents detailing their operations. This wasn't just a small poaching ring. It was part of something much larger. A ranger knelt beside an open crate, his face grim as he examined its contents. Inside, drugged animals lay motionless, some rare, others wounded, all of them victims of greed. "This is bigger than we thought," one of the agents muttered. "These bastards have been running an international trafficking ring." Harold didn't respond. He simply watched as justice unfolded before him. The poachers' leader, the stocky man who had ordered the capture of the mother bear, sneered as he was hauled to his feet. He caught Harold's eye and spat at the ground. "You think this changes anything, old man?" he growled. "There's always gonna be people like us. Always a market, always a buyer." Harold stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice as steady as stone, he said, "Yeah, then maybe it's time we start running out of sellers." The man's smirk faltered as he was shoved toward a waiting police vehicle. Justice had found him today, and Harold had made damn sure of it. As the commotion died down, the veterinarians arrived, working swiftly to tend to the mother bear's injuries. "She's lost a lot of blood," one of them muttered, pressing a hand to the grizzly's side. "But she's a fighter." Harold stood nearby, rifle slung over his shoulder, watching as they administered medicine, cleaned wounds, and checked for internal damage. All the while, the bear cubs never left her side. They nudged her, whimpered softly, their small bodies trembling. When she finally stirred, weak but alive, they pressed against her, their relief almost tangible. One of the rangers turned to Harold. "She'll make it, thanks to you." He didn't say anything. He just nodded. He wasn't looking for gratitude. But as he watched the mother bear slowly lift her head, her tired eyes meeting his for just a moment, he felt something shift inside him. She knew. She remembered. And in that brief, unspoken moment, Harold understood something he had never truly considered before. These animals weren't just creatures of instinct. They recognized kindness. They sought help when they had no other options. And somehow, they had known to come to him. As the days passed, news of the poaching bust spread. Conservation groups celebrated the rescue of dozens of endangered animals. Federal authorities dismantled an entire smuggling network spanning multiple countries. But the story that fascinated the world the most, the bears. Scientists were stunned. They debated, questioned, analyzed every detail. Could bears really recognize individual humans? Did they have memories strong enough to recall past kindness? And more than that, could they understand when to seek out help? Harold didn't care much for the speculation. He wasn't a scientist. He didn't need research to tell him what he already knew. Those cubs had come to him because they trusted him. Because they remembered. And that meant something. It meant everything. Years passed. Harold remained in his cabin, deep in the Alaskan wilderness, living as he always had, alone, but never truly lonely. And every so often, as he walked through the forest at dawn, he would catch a glimpse of something between the trees. Two massive bears, their golden-brown fur catching the morning light. The cubs had grown. They were no longer small, helpless creatures scrambling over logs. They were powerful, majestic, true rulers of the wild. But they never forgot him. Sometimes, they watched from a distance, their dark eyes following him as he moved through the trees. Other times, they came closer, never too close, never intruding, just acknowledging, as if they remembered, as if they knew. Harold would nod in return. A silent greeting, a quiet understanding. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, they would vanish back into the endless green, blending into the world they belonged to. Harold smiled. He had once thought he had left the world behind. But the truth was, the world had never left him. And as long as these forests stood, as long as the wild remained untamed and free, he would never truly be alone. Because some bonds, no matter how unlikely, could never be broken.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.